Yeah, let's just spend a couple of minutes here just to get people seated.
Hello? Hello? All right. Sounds, I think so. The volume sounds a little weak, but hello.
So, everyone.
One last thing.
People still finding the seat. So, while Erik is preparing, let me introduce Erik. So, I'm really excited to have Erik around. So, we flew Erik in from San Francisco. Erik is a quite active member on the Ember.js core team. And personally, I'm quite curious to hear what this Ember thing is about and why the heck we need yet another framework. So, let's give Erik a warm welcome.
Thank you. All right, so my presentation involves a little bit of live coding, so hopefully everything will go well technically. So let's go ahead and drop this up to presentation mode. All right, looks good. So thanks for having me. This is my first time in Denmark. I've become, I haven't had a chance to do too much sightseeing yet, but I'm here till Saturday, so hopefully I'll be able to do some drinking with everyone tonight and tomorrow. But I did just have my first $30 burger here in Denmark yesterday, so that was great. Let's see. Oh God. No. There we go. All right. So yeah, I'm Erik. I'm on the Ember.js core team. I've been really lucky. I've been able to work with Ember for the last 3 years, just over 3 years actually, and majority of that time I've been able to spend doing consulting with Ember. So I've been able to go to different companies like Netflix, Square, and Zendesk, among others, to help them build Ember applications and also do other cool things like performance tuning and whatnot. So this talk is just a quick little introduction to Ember. We're not going to be able to cover every aspect of Ember, but let's talk at a high level. What is Ember? So if you're at all familiar with Ember, if you've heard of it before, I'm curious, can you raise your hands who has heard of Ember previously? All right, so at least half the crowd, if not more. So if you've heard of Ember, you've probably heard our famous slogan, which is it's a framework for creating ambitious web applications. And so let's unravel a little bit what we mean by ambitious web applications, because for those of you who haven't heard of Ember, or perhaps are new to this scene of ambitious web application development, what does that actually mean? So in order to explain that, let's touch a little bit about on what I would call traditional web applications. And so, in my opinion, there's a transition underway, and we're going from a world of server-rendered HTML. And so, you're using frameworks today like Ruby on Rails, perhaps, Django, some JSP, PHP, ASP, some form of basically generating HTML, and that work is done on your server, and the server sends down basically a big string of markup for the browser to parse and render for you, right? And so this has served us well for a long time because previously the web browser was this really stupid, crippled application that ran on a user's machine, right? Like the state of the art, the bleeding edge of web development, at one point was form fields, right? Images were not part of the original HTML spec. Form fields were not either. Those were features that got added in after the fact via web browsers. So we started off with this world of server-rendered HTML because there was no alternative. And so when we started building more complex web applications, we started to want to have compelling user experiences that were similar to those that could be experienced in native platforms. And so that led to the world of somewhat close to the world of today, and for a lot of us, it's still the world of today, which is the world of just sprinkling in JavaScript. And so we have applications that are primarily server-driven. So not only are they just server-rendered HTML, but any interactions, like you type in data in a form, you hit a button, that interaction triggers some behavior to go back to the server. And the server decides, okay, I need to do this thing now. Here's the new HTML for the user to see, right? And so this led into this world that we're in, or that we've been in, which is the jQuery world of, and not to diminish jQuery. jQuery is extremely groundbreaking for us as web developers. We were writing ad hoc JavaScript code that needed to go in, query the DOM, attach event behavior, and whatnot, and jQuery gave us a solid foundation in which to start doing that. But what happens is you start building richer and richer applications, and you end up with which is what is famously coined jQuery spaghetti, right? And so jQuery is a library that provides an easy way to query and attach event handlers, and there's a plugin architecture as well, and so it's easy to just get off the ground running and start building some interactivity inside of what was a traditionally server-generated HTML-based web application. And so However, the more and more richness that you start adding into an application, the more and more of this spaghetti that gets created. And so the other aspect of this is that sometimes you need to handle behavior on both the client and the server, right? So you might want to have a part of your application that can dynamically generate HTML and update the display on the user's browser. But then if they refresh the page, the server needs to know how to also generate that HTML for the user, right? So what this leads to is duplication of logic and templating code and rendering code that needs to live on both the client and the server. And so hopefully to the most of you, this is old boring news. We're kind of, I think, maybe halfway to a world of moving away from this traditional web application development and to more client-side heavy techniques. And so, but we are just really beginning to fully exploit the power of modern browsers. And so what I want to say is I want to in your minds, equate ambitious applications with browser applications, right? And so what I mean by browser applications are they're applications that run in the browser fully, just like your iOS or Android application runs on your Android or iOS device fully, right? You're not clicking a button in your iOS app, which then communicates to a server, and the server then returns data that a JPEG image of what should display on the screen, right? It's up to the iPhone. It's up to the app running on the device to determine how the app should be rendered, right? And so this is the world that we focus in on in Ember.js, the world for ambitious apps, the world for rich client-side JavaScript apps. So why Ember? The big talking point that most of you have probably heard is our focus on conventions. And alongside of, and so what do we mean by conventions? Well, we mean there should be a way to do something, right? And there should be a way to name your objects, to name your classes, to name your files, etc. And those things should scale. Those should be part of learning the framework. Those should be, and your team should be able to easily, and once learned those things, they should be able to easily jump across different parts of the application, and code looks relatively similar no matter who wrote it. A shared foundation, so that means you don't have to write any code, or you should have to, the amount of code that you have to write for your application to do something should be limited to domain-specific concerns as much as possible. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then community. So Ember is somewhat unique in that we are trying to solve a lot of the problems of building these ambitious browser applications, and we're trying to do it in a way that is a turnkey solution, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means you should be able to get sufficiently far building an application without feeling like you need to invent something yourself, perhaps. So one of the things that needs to be really acknowledged, I think, up front in getting into this world of conventions and frameworks is to realize that most apps aren't special. And this is a quote that I stole from David Hannemeyer Hansen, who's a Dane you might have heard of. And he obviously worked on Ruby on Rails, and he gave this great talk where he acknowledged that one of the big reasons why the Rails community was able to be so large and successful was the recognition that we're in this together, and that a lot of the problem space that we have to solve when we're building an application is shared. And so this is a philosophy that we embrace in the Ember community. We believe that we can share a common foundation of code. And so we also want to make less decisions because, of course, when you're making less decisions means you're hopefully writing less code yourself because it's provided by the framework. And it's important to acknowledge that every line of code you write ends up as a liability, right? You have to maintain that code. If you leave the team, somebody else is going to have to pick up that code and run with it. And so that means you can, when you're making less decisions and you're writing less code that isn't domain specific, you can actually spend that time you would be creating that code to work on your app's domain specific problems themselves. So again, conventions, the team knows where your code belongs, and another nice advantage of this when you adopt a shared solution is that when you hire new people that know that technology already, they're productive from day one. And it's not uncommon to hear from Ember, from companies using Ember, when they hire somebody that already knows Ember, the person is able to come in on day one and actually commit code and deploy it. It's really a powerful thing. And so, to touch a bit on the Ember community, really one of the secret things behind the Ember project is that we really built Ember to build a community because we wanted to focus on building browser apps and have a set of solutions that we can all use so that we can stop focusing on the how of building browser apps, but focusing on the app we want to build. And so this is in stark contrast to the general JavaScript community, which is extremely fragmented. And if you think about it, this is just inherent to the JavaScript ecosystem because JavaScript itself has been developed over a long period of time. The ways in which JavaScript is used is very different across applications. And so we wanted to create a community that was focused on one thing so that we could really wrestle it to the ground. And so this shared architecture provides a shared experience, which is really important because the community is able to actually identify problems and provide solutions to itself. And so in my mind and what I've seen thus far is that communities working together create unforeseeable productivity gains. And so because we've decided to tackle this problem space together, we're able to actually do more than if we were using solutions that were more of a pick and choose, the libraries that you want to use, package them up, and you've basically created your own framework inside of your application. And so this is this is going to be a quick taste of some of the features that Ember provides you, and then we're going to jump into live coding, and we'll see those in action. So really the main thing, if you've seen us ever talk about Ember before, is one of the big things that we talk about a lot is routing. And that's because URLs matter, right? URLs have made the web as successful as it is today in large part. And why is that? Well, it's because you're able to share content extremely easily, right? You're able to bookmark content, come back. And you're able to, this is a linchpin to what is considered, in my mind, a successful web application. And so the idea is to make having solid URL support in your client-side application really painless. And so this is something that Ember tries to provide for you as you're building. Another big feature is data binding. So the quick way of surmising what data binding is, for those of you who don't know, is that it basically keeps your DOM up to date for you. So as your JavaScript objects change, your application's rendered output automatically reflects those changes. You don't have to write that glue code yourself. And then the last big feature that I want to touch on is components. And so components are really the building blocks of your UI, and I'm not going to touch too much on them right here, but the basic premise is that they're reusable and shareable, right? So you should be able to build a component, you should be able to use it in multiple parts of your application, and you should be able to share it with other people publicly if you want, or privately within your organization. You might have multiple Ember apps. You want to be able to build these components and share them easily. So without further ado, let's jump into the live coding. So this is where it's going to get fun. So, all right. Hopefully, I'm going to probably have to bump the font size down a bit. All right. So we're going to start off with routing. So we're going to actually use a really simple mechanism for doing these demos up at first, and then we're going to see the more production-ready way of doing these things. So this is basically a copy of the Ember starter kit. So if you go to Ember.js.com, there's a button that says, download the starter kit. So what this does is it gives you a very easy way without installing any software on your machine. You just get a zip file, basically. It gives you a really easy environment to get up and running with Ember. And so what we're going to do here is, I'm just going to do a little bit of shuffling around here. And so really what starts off the building of an Ember application, or I should say the execution of Ember application, is this one line of JavaScript up here, which is the creation of an Ember application object. And so here, just to give you an idea, let me load that up in our browser so we can see what we're working with here right now. So right now we've just got a simple application that just boots up to this H2 being displayed. And so in our DOM, all we have really is this script tag. And what the script tag is just a simple way, without having any template compilation, to throw some handlebars code into the document. And this template does not actually get rendered until the Ember application object gets created. And so that's what we're doing right here. Right? And so to the router. So the router, basically, we have a very simple, what we call a DSL. It stands for domain-specific language. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying write nice-looking code, right? So we want to define the structure of our application's router. And so we're going to do something really simple to begin with, is we're just going to create two resources. And so we'll have a first and second resource. And so now, if we go and restart our application, nothing's going to change here. We haven't done anything. But the interesting thing is now we can actually go and just with those two lines of code, now what we can do is we can go create some templates. And the way we're going to do this now is via script tags with an ID. This is not how you do it typically. This is for demo purposes. And so if we go and create a template with the same name as our route that we just defined, we can now type in some code here. This is the first route. And so now we're actually in an index route right now, so we're not actually seeing anything. But let's actually add in a link to this route from our main page. So we'll add in a little UL here with an LI. And so we're going to link to that first route. We'll put the contents of the link here. And so you'll see what we're doing here is we're kind of mixing HTML with handlebars syntax. And so handlebars is just is the templating library that Ember uses. It's it's a mustache superset, if you've heard of those. And so basically we've got a link to helper. And the great thing about this link to helper is not only does it generate a link for us, but it generates us a link with the proper href based on the route that we're linking to. So here we're linking to first, and this first keyword here, this first string, is actually referencing the name of the resource that we had, which also is referencing the name of the template that we have, right? So this is an example of a convention in Ember where we've created a string identifier in our router definition, and now we refer to that everywhere inside of our application. And so we go ahead, we can now see here, if we inspect this element, we'll actually see that there's an href generated automatically for us, right? Which is cool. So what this means is that not only are we not stuck managing the those URLs in our links manually, but or perhaps not even having them there at all in some cases, you can actually this enables the user to have typical web behavior because we're generating these URLs for you. You can right-click and open in a new tab, and it's going to display the application just like you would expect from a normal server-generated application, right? And so, we can click this route. We can add another link. We can see that we can navigate through these routes in our application. And it's important to point out that this is not a complete refresh of the browser context, right? This is a client-side application. When we navigate between parts of the application, we're actually not fully refreshing the browser, right? We're just swapping in and out the portions of content related to our routes. So I'm adding in a second link here. I'm adding a second template here. And voila, right? So this is just a local file system path, right? But you can see we've got these hash-based URLs. And the cool thing about this is that we actually have a strategy that allows you to use push state. Automatically, it comes in the framework. If you configure it, you'll get push state-based URLs, so no hashes in browsers that support it, and hash-based URLs in browsers that don't support push state yet. And it'll actually automatically convert between the two for you, so you don't have to spend any time worrying about browser compatibility with regards to the routing system. So this is fine and dandy. This is basic linking, right? Nothing too special. But one extra feature that I want to point out here is that we also give you the ability to have automatic. We get some extra functionality alongside of this, which is, this is a very basic application. Obviously, when we navigate across our applications, we might be loading data that we need to wait until it's fetched to be able to actually display the area of the applications that we're navigating to. So Ember has this really cool feature that just comes for free called loading states. And so I'm going to whip up a quick hand-wavy example here. But if we define a route object for our second route, which is the route that is going to actually do some data loading here in our example, we've got a method on routes that Ember will call called model. And so if we were to, inside of the model hook here, this is typically where you would do any kind of data fetching that your application would need to do in order to display the content on this section of the application. And so, typically that'll mean something like $.ajax, right? But for our example, we're going to do something. I have a little simple example worked out of like a slow Ajax call. And so I have magically the slow Ajax function. And so now, right now we haven't done anything fancy here. But you can see actually when I was refreshing, there's a delay here. The slow Ajax call takes 3 seconds to finish. So when we're navigating between the application, right, we're like waiting to send the user to the next area of the application until all the data is loaded. And obviously that's not a great user experience. Ideally there wouldn't be cases where there would be these large areas of data loading, right? And that is also important, when we are refreshing the application as a whole. There is to the user, the application is just blank. We can't actually render it until we have the data, and that's on a complete, on an initial navigation. So Ember gives us this great feature that if we just drop in a template named loading, we will automatically put the content of that template inside of the area that is representative of that route's content. And so I don't want to dive too much into it, but basically that's what this outlet helper here is basically where the dynamic content goes. If you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, it's something like yield, typically. So right, we're clicking on these links and we're swapping, Ember is swapping the contents of the outlet for the templates that we've defined here. And so we can go ahead and now refresh. And when we click on the second link here, we're going to actually see a loading indicator automatically get displayed for us, right? And so we didn't actually have to write any code. This is part of the power that having a framework that provides conventions and gives you. You don't have to think about it. So from there, let's go off to data binding. And so data binding is not not too hard of a concept, but let's say that instead of our slow AJAX call, we want to return some data here. And so let's return an array. Let's say we're gonna, we're just synchronously returning something here, but you could imagine it's an AJAX call, right, that goes to your server. And we're gonna return a bunch of objects that have the names of countries. And so we'll do Denmark, Sweden, and is there something I don't know? Norway. So we're going to return that array of data here in our second route. And so now if we jump over to our template here, we can actually start using that data inside of our template. And so we are returning an array of data, so we're going to loop over that. And so the way we can do that is we can say, we use the each helper. So we're looping over. And we're going to output the name of each country here to begin with. So we'll wrap that in some kind of UI. So now here we are. We've got that list, right? So this is not really data binding, right? This is just templating at this point, right? What we want to do is we want to actually exercise. We want to add something to this array dynamically, and we don't want to have to write any code that's involved with updating the display of this list in the DOM, right, in the page. So how can we do that? Well, an easy way to do that would be like having a little text box to add a country. And so we'll do that. We're gonna, this is a input helper, which closely resembles the input tag, right? So we're gonna use this to get a text field. The difference between this input, the reason we're using this input helper is that it allows us to bind to the value of the text field. So to show you an example of that, we're going to bind this to a property called new country. And so if we actually output new country, we can actually see that happening. So like so, right? Nothing too crazy. This is just typical data binding stuff you've seen before. Now, let's add a button real quick to further flesh this out. So we're going to have an add country button. And so here we're using the action helper, which makes it really easy for us to turn some kind of, to trigger basically, this is used for click actions. It's very, very simple types of actions that are triggered from the user interface. So here, the button tag is going to, on click, trigger this action called add country. And so I'm going to dive in a little bit more. We're going to have, in Ember, typically, you have the notion of a controller. And I'm not going to dive too much into all the nitty-gritty details of this stuff. But basically, controllers are one of the places where you likely are going to handle actions like this in your application. So we're going to have an add country action. And the job of this add country action is going to be to take that value that's inside of the text field and put it inside of the array of values that we're rendering to our DOM. And so basically, there's a push object method on top of an array controller. And this controller basically, in your mind, you should think of it as a presenter object on top of the array. It's basically, you can almost think of it as the array of objects itself. The model hook, basically, the return value of the model hook is used to instantiate the related controller to a route inside of an Ember application. So here we can go ahead and push an object. And so just to show this off in the most basic example, we're going to push Iceland. Okay, all right. So I'm glad Iceland's getting Jag talar pínur íslensku. I'm actually Icelandic. My grandfather immigrated. My last name isn't Bryn, it's actually Brynjolfsson, but nobody can pronounce that, so I go by Bryn. So here we're going to add that action. And so now if we click this button, we're adding Iceland to the list automatically, right? All we're thinking about here is array manipulations. So we're not worried about the nitty-gritty of updating the DOM, which is this is really the power of data binding. So I'm going to quickly jump to adding that new country value. And so basically, it turns out when we are binding to this property new country, that's actually property that's getting stored on the controller itself. So we're able to access that and push it into the array of countries. And the other thing we need to do when we do this is we actually want to clear the value of the new country field. So we're going to just set that to null. And you might be squinting at the code that I'm writing here and being like, why is he using push object instead of push? Why is he using get? Why is he using set? Well, basically, Ember provides a data binding mechanism, but that is cross-platform, so it works, on browsers as old as IE6. And so the way that we're able to actually observe the changes to your data structures is by using these specialized APIs for mutation on these data structures. And as we're actually looking at how we can make some of this stuff a little cleaner in the future as we're able to start moving our browser compatibility requirements towards the newer side of IE browsers. But fortunately, a lot of people still want to support browsers like IE 7 and 8. So here we go. What we're doing here is, again, we click this button. It triggers our add country. We're going to add Iceland manually, except we're going to put an exclamation point here. Oh, no. I'm sorry. I forgot to push. It's an object with a name property, not just the string itself. So there we see Iceland, right? So now real quick, just to, again, hammer it home, this is not anything too groundbreaking, but hopefully it helps you think of how you can have your web application be more of a matter of mutating data structures rather than like mutating DOM, right? And having to worry about all the different places in the DOM that this data might be displayed, right? And this is that's the world of jQuery spaghetti that we're trying to get away from, right? So we're going to have a remove country action, and basically, so what we'll do is we'll just put a button inside of each LI here. We'll say remove country. And a nice little aspect of actions as well is they take arguments. So we can actually pass in the current iteration of the loop as this. So this will be that object, that are like one of these iterations, right? This object. So we can pass that in when we click on that. And so now we're getting that object passed in here. And so now removing a country is just as simple as calling our remove object method and just passing that country in, right? And so hopefully, if all goes well. Oh, something does not go well. Thank you. Human.js hint here up in the front row. Thank you very much. All right, so I forgot to put something in my button and close the button tag as well. Derp, derp. So we'll put a little X there. All right, so people don't like Sweden, so goodbye Sweden, right? So that's all it takes, really. That's data binding, right? All right, so that brings us to the last little example I wanted to cover right now, which was components. And so we've covered a little bit of routing, a little bit of data mining, now components. So components are really, if you remember back to the slides, they're really about helping you build building blocks of UI that you can reuse and share. And so this is going to be a ridiculously simple example of a component, but hopefully it'll be something that you can see a simple example and extrapolate it out. So let's go over to our first route. And again, these things are just automatically working. And if we remove something and leave and come back. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I'm lying. That's actually weird. Why isn't that? All right. Anyways, demo fail. So really what components are about is creating are kind of like creating your own little syntaxes, your own little handlebars helpers for use inside of your templates. So what do I mean by that? I mean if we wanted to create a date picker, we should be able to have a shorthand for referring to that common UI element throughout the application. And so with the so we've had the concept of components in Ember for a while, and we didn't actually call them components originally, but there's a lot of work being done in the standards world to bring what are called web components to life. And so the way that I want you to think about components they're basically like Ember, the version of web components that you can use in Ember today cross-browser, right? You don't need to worry about polyfills or anything like that. It's really a similar ambition, right, that we're trying to provide. And as those specs come to life, we're going to start integrating them into Ember and hopefully having a nice, everything will turn up roses and everything will be compatible. And that's the way the web world works, right? So really, components are about in the web component world would be about custom elements, right? And so this is actually something that we have planned inside of in an upcoming version of Ember is to actually enable you to use the custom element syntax, so it looks like normal markup rather than having to use the handlebar syntax. But right now we're stuck in a world of handlebar syntax. So that'll be cool when we have it. So components, again, here we go. We've got our date picker. Let's start building this component. The easiest way to start up and running with building a component is actually you can define a template that matches the name of the component, and that will automatically allow you to use it in other parts of your application. So what do I mean by that? Well, turns out we've got this little convention that if you have a template named components / the name of your component, now we will automatically do the work of wiring that thing up. So here in our first route, we can see that this template is getting, obviously taken out of the other set of script tags. The component's getting created, and anywhere we refer to date picker, that template's going to get rendered. So again, this is not just a one-off thing. We can do this multiple times, right? We can have multiple date pickers on a page at once. But this is boring. This is just text, right? So let's actually make this date picker do something. And so we're going to just use jQuery UI's date picker because it's like the easiest thing to use out of nowhere. So what a jQuery UI date picker consists of is basically an input field, right? That we turn into, we enhance into this date picker component. So what we're going to use is Ember's input helper to create something to create this text field. And you're going to see here that I'm referring to this date property out of nowhere. You might be wondering, like, where's that coming from? Well, the cool thing about components is that you can actually pass data into them. So, I'm going to eliminate these extra uses. So, like, we can actually pass in a date here. So, if we pass in, 2014, 09, 04, now that input field is going to have the contents of that value that we passed in. And so in this example, this is just a static value that I'm specifying manually inside of the template. But of course, this might be, if you're building an app that's, for booking flights, you might have like, the departure date or something, right? And so you'd be binding departure date from your application's, data modeling to the date picker's date field. Right? And so here inside of our date component, that value would get propagated through as well. So, so this is all fine and dandy. We're showing a text field, but we're not actually bootstrapping any of that jQuery UI functionality, right? So let me actually go find the CDN stuff that I had. And we'll drop that into our application so that we actually have jQuery UI on our page here. All right, so we have jQuery UI now. And so what we want to do here is, if you're familiar with jQuery UI, we're going to want to call date picker, on some selector, right? And so where do we do this where are we going to, we know we need to write that code. Where does it go? Well, correlating to this we have a component template here, which is very simple. It's where we put the markup that our component needs to do its job. We also have a class definition for a component as well that we can provide. So we're going to add a date picker component object, and this is going to be a subclass of an Ember component class. And so the big takeaway here is that there's this really important hook inside of components called that insert element. And this is basically the place where you get to do the work. Ember has created the DOM element that your component is represented by for you, and now here's the point at which in the instantiation process where you can go do whatever you want to this component, right? And so this is where, long story short, this is where we can go and say like, hey, that input tag, let's call the date picker method on it, right? And so now inside of our application, hopefully we can just click this now and magic, right? And so, this is important. A couple important things to note that, we're not worried about the creation and management of the DOM for this date picker, right? If you think about the jQuery spaghetti approach to doing something like this, is that you tend to have a we tend to have a very specific selector that you need to use that you would apply, to each individual field in the application. But really, when we're talking about Ember components, we're talking about the data inside of your application getting passed into a component, the component being concerned only with its responsibilities, and then when you're using these things inside of your application, you're just dealing with, the interaction layer is really the data that you're passing in, so in the case of, that ticket booking app, the departure date, and there's also the ability for these components to have actions as well. So you might want to say, there might be like an on change trigger a date changed event inside of your application. But I'm apparently running short on time, so I need to hurry these things up. So such is live demos. So that's basically what I wanted to touch on real briefly with components. So let's get back to the slides real quick, and then we'll have one little extra set of demo. So really, I want to talk just real quickly. Hopefully this has sparked some interest in Ember for you. And so let's talk about how we get started with Ember. And this is an interesting story that I think is not unlike your perhaps experiences with other JavaScript libraries or frameworks. And so, the solution of getting started with Ember yesterday was really this bring your own tools system. And so, if you think about what it takes to build a web app,
we lost.
All right. Well, this will be fun. All right. So, so the story that we're used to is we're used to if you're doing server rendered HTML, you're probably using some technology that's provided with your backend technology. So, for example, with Rails, you've got the asset pipeline. Django has its own solution. The ASP and Java Worlds have their own asset building solutions that provide functionality along the lines of these things, right? Like you might want to use Sass, you might want to use CoffeeScript. Handlebars templates need to get compiled for you, ideally, so which enables you to put them into separate files instead of into the HTML like I was doing in our example. You might want to have, you hopefully are writing tests for your application's code, so you need to have a test runner configured, and you need to do all of these things. In yesterday's world of Ember development, and probably today's world of development for you, if you're using something similar, is something like Grunt or Gulp or whatever, and you end up really building your own and configuring your own tool set that you're using one-off on a particular application that you're building. And so, this was today in Emberland, though, we identified this as like a big problem for getting up and running with Ember. It was not only hard enough to learn Ember, but it was hard enough for people that are new to this world of writing client-side JavaScript applications to actually be able to, get a build system set up and figure out how do you deploy, how do you minify. All these things are really hard to do, and so. We wanted to solve the problem for all Ember users, new and old, so we created a project called the Ember CLI. And so the the quick way of getting Ember CLI set up is that you just install, there should be a -G in there, oops. You npm install a package, you get an Ember command, you can create, this is just like Rails, right? You can create a new application and you can get it up and running. It also has other commands as well, as we'll see in a second. So another big thing that's been problematic in the JavaScript world and the Ember world has been sharing code. And so we've got a cool little project we're working on called Add-ons that I want to show you as well. So we'll jump back in here. This is going to be challenging now. All right, so let's see. So basically, because we're at a conference and conference Wi-Fi, well, here is non-existent, but is usually problematic. I'm not going to do the whole Ember new and npm install thing because that takes a while. But basically, you know, the TLDR is you can Ember new a project. We're already in a project. Inside of that project, we can run the Ember serve command. And actually, I think I'm already running this in this tab here. So we can run the Ember serve command. And that'll get our Ember application up and running on a port locally, so that's great. And we jump over here, we can see this is a very simple Ember application using Ember CLI. And the one-handed thing is really crippling here. So inside of our Ember application, we've got, you know, here is the real way that things get done in the Ember world. We actually have separate files for templates, right? So in our example, we would have a first.hbs file inside of this templates directory inside of our application. And so Ember CLI does a bunch of work to actually set up a common directory structure for our application. So everybody on the team knows where files go. They don't have to worry about these things, right? And so real quick, since we're running out of time, I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive in Ember CLI, but basically it comes with a few commands out of the box other than the serve command, and one of those is Ember test. So we actually provide you a test runner built into your application. So you just run Ember test, and this does the work of running your tests in a CLI, and this is great because now you can actually deploy this to your continuous integration environment. You get that for free. It also provides your tests running at a a URL in the browser, so you can have a tests a test runner that you can use the debugger with as well. And I don't have any examples, but this little box here is you can actually see the tests running through the application, so you can actually watch your application be interacted with. There's Ember build, so Ember applications just tend to be static assets. It's a generated HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file, and so the build command just ends up giving you a bunch of static assets that you can deploy to a CDN. So that's Ember build. And there's actually plugins that give you Ember deploy. And so you can actually deploy, just like you might be used to with Heroku, you can actually deploy your Ember application immediately off to a hosting provider with a one-line command, which is really cool. What I wanted to show real quick was add-ons. So basically, there's a handful of add-ons out there. One of them, I don't have that open. One of them is a date picker, kind of like what we were writing. And so this is ridiculous. So we'll npm install -g. The plugin is called Ember CLI date picker. And so I'm not going to run this because I don't trust the Wi-Fi. But basically, you would run this. I've already installed it. And what this is doing, we're in an empty Ember application right now, right? And so when we run this command, this is actually going to do some work to install a package, and it's going to actually expose a component that we can use inside of our Ember application. And it happens to be called date picker. It's not the same one we wrote in our before demo, but it's one that's provided by somebody in the Ember community for you to use in your application. And so here, after running that npm install command, we can drop into our Ember application, start referring to this component that we didn't implement ourselves. There's no date picker component template or date picker component JavaScript file, and so now we can actually just start using a community provided component inside of our application just by running a install command on the command line. and referring to it in our templates, right? So this is really what we consider the next generation kind of functionality that we can provide in the Ember community, which is not only having conventions and solutions for building applications, but also solutions for sharing code across applications, and having tight integration, deep integration with those systems, so that things like a component being exposed inside of your application for use actually takes a fair amount of wiring, and something like npm by itself, without Ember CLI, or something like Bower, don't provide mechanisms for frameworks to actually hook in easily and enable these kinds of things to be done. So this is stuff we had to do ourselves. So I think that is the timer telling me I'm out of time. So we've just started working on add-ons, and we're really excited about the promise of them. And an important point I want to make is that this command line utility that we're building to complement Ember itself is really an enabling technology that's going to enable us to have some nice features like modular application builds, which means that if your file size, if you're worried about file size, and that's one of the reasons why you might not be interested in using Ember, well, Ember CLI is going to enable us to know what code you're using inside of Ember, inside of your application, and your resulting production builds will only include the parts of Ember that you actually use, not Ember, the whole piece of Ember itself, right? Which is cool. And then things like lazy loading, so like if you might want parts of your application to not include all of the application source code, you might want only the code that's relevant to perhaps creating a new blog post to be loaded at that point, and then when you go to the the admin section, all the code that's related to the admin section gets loaded in separately, and so this increases initial boot times. And then also, we can enable the Ember community to use new language features before they exist in browsers. So things like ES6 modules we're already using in Ember CLI. Things like fat arrows and multi-line strings, string templates are great. And so really, we're kind of uniquely positioned in the JavaScript world here to provide a full suite of features and an experience that really, is hard to do on your own without a large community of people behind it supporting it. And so, we're building this community, and we're really excited about it, and we invite you to come join us. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik. So we're doing coffee break now, so now it's time to actually stretch your legs. We open the doors here so you can get outside and maybe see some sunlight. So we will be back here at 10. I'm putting a slide up, and I'm pretty strict about it. So we start at 10 sharp.